All right, everybody, welcome back to A Road to Return. This is the sixth session of our classes on the Rambam's Laws of Tshuva. Excited to continue learning this wonderful Torah with you. I'll now share my screen. We're in the beginning of chapter 3, and now what Rambam's going to do really is set up sort of how a person's sins and transgressions are balanced, how a person is judged. And of course, he's not just making this up. This comes from Tractate Rosh Hashanah. It comes from a whole sugi in the Gemara and the Talmud about this. And I think learning this also really helps to understand a lot of the stuff we see in the Machzor and everything like that. So I think really important to learn, whether you believe it literally or it is a myth to you. I think it is a helpful paradigm to sort of think of. So let's jump in. He says, each and every person has merits and sins. A person whose merits exceeds his sins is termed righteous. A person whose sins exceeds his merits is termed wicked. If his sins and merits are equal, he is termed a Beinuni, which means middle, right, average. The same applies to an entire country. If the merits of all its inhabitants exceed their sins, it is termed righteous. If their sins are greater, it is termed wicked. The same applies to the entire world. So, number one, the important paradigm that he sets up is that your meritorious actions or your good actions are sort of measured against the bad actions you take or the transgressions you make, right? In Judaism, we have mitzvot behavior or behavior that's considered obligatory and that you need to be doing, and those are considered merits. And then you have transgressions, right, that are violations of the Torah and the laws of the Torah, and those are considered transgressions. And there's a whole bunch of actions in the middle, right, that are neutral, right, that are neither mitzvot or transgressions. But regardless, and I do think it's worth noting here that the term he uses is not mitzvah here. He uses zechuyot, which means meritorious things. That's why it's translated merits here, right? And so it's not necessarily just mitzvot here or things that are specifically commanded of us, but I would say good actions, right? Even going above, it definitely counts actions also where you go above and beyond what the law requires, but you go above and beyond. Now, importantly, the language is different. Avonot is a technical term meaning transgression or breaking a law of the Torah, not just any kind of bad action. And I think this really is helpful for teaching us that, it's not just mitzvot that are the required actions of the Torah. Of course, that's important, but it's also the full range of all of the good you can do in the world. And that's a much more expansive definition than transgressions, which are a much more finer category of classical or things that fit into the realm of breaking a particular Torah law. And it's nice to hear that what Rambam seems to be doing is expanding the area that we can apply towards good actions. But in general, we weigh the two of them together almost like a scale, and whichever one there's more, that's what you're considered in this regard. And then, of course, if they are the same, you're considered a Beinuni, or in the middle. And a lot of discussion has been had of what does this Beinuni mean? What does this middle mean? Because really, what's the chances that your good actions line up literally exactly to a 1-to-1 ratio with the bad actions? I mean, how many actions do you take in your life, right? Or how many mitzvot, how many zechuyot or good actions you take, and how many transgressions do you make in your lifetime? Think about the chances of there really being a Beinuni or a middle category. And the reason this is important is because within this understanding, the people who are have more transgressions than who are righteous are considered evil, right? Are considered bad, and therefore are written in the book of that they do not they're in this myth. There's usually two books. There's the book of life and the book of death, right? And these people are signed in the book of death, right, on Rosh Hashanah. while the ones who have more righteous action than transgressive action are signed into the book of life on Rosh Hashanah. And the middle people actually are the ones who are held up, that on Rosh Hashanah they're declared to be a Beinuni, right in the middle, and then they have 10 days to do tshuva and prove that they are worthy to be written in the book of life, to do tshuva by doing tshuva, and this is determined finally on Yom Kippur. If this be the case, then the category of Beinuni would be so small, and then most people would not really be, those 10 days necessarily wouldn't matter. Yom Kippur would not be really the day people are getting atonement or being written in the book of life, rather Rosh Hashanah. So it's an open question that many have asked on this. Is this a whole category of people? How does this exactly work? I'm going to leave it as an open question today. What's interesting, of course, here also is that we are not just judged as individuals. We are judged as members of a community, members of a country, members of a state, members of a group, members of the world, right? And we are judged on all of these levels, right? And our actions also add into that calculus of, everybody in the synagogue, everybody in the community, everybody in the family. And in some ways, this might even be more important than the individual merits and transgressions. Is how do we how do we work in terms of a group, in terms of a community, in terms of a country? And I think this is important. Oftentimes, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, it might be that in this system, they might do a lot of good, but they happen to be part of a community or a country or a state or a world that is doing much more evil. And so therefore they would be punished based on that and that understanding. That's very different than the way we usually think. And I think that's really, really important to understand, that our judgment does not just depend on our own behavior, but certainly depends on everybody else in all of the various groups and communities that we belong in. Let's keep moving. Number 2. And this is according to the Rambam. If a person's sins exceeds his merit, he will immediately die because of his wickedness. As it states, I have smitten you for the multitude of your transgressions. So the Rambam seems to simply state that when you're judged, you have more transgressions than righteous things, you're just going to be killed, right? And you're going to die. Similarly, a country whose sins are great will immediately be obliterated, as implied by the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, right? So it's just as Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because of their sins, so too the same thing happens when a whole entire country is the same way. In regard to the entire world as well, where its inhabitants' sins to be greater than their merits, they would immediately be destroyed. As Genesis relates, God saw the evil of man, and God said, I will destroy man. Right now, it's interesting. I don't know how Rambam would necessarily react to this, but we know that there's the promise that the world will never be flooded again. That was a promise that was made. I don't know how this would figure. Maybe Rambam would read this very narrowly, right? That's just only God promising not to flood the world again, but destroy the entire world. Maybe that's something that could happen. Now, obviously, the big question is, we don't see this happening very often, where a person immediately dies because their transgressions are over their merits. So I think important to understand what this really means here. But just to keep going here and to understand what he's saying, the reckoning is not calculated only on the basis of the number of merits and sins, but also takes into account their magnitude, right? There are some merits which outweigh many sins, as applied in Kings, because in him there is found a good quality. In contrast, a sin may outweigh many merits, as Ecclesiastes states, one sin may obscure much good. The weighing of sins and merits is carried out according to the wisdom of the knowing God. He knows how to measure merits against sins, right? And this is only a wisdom that God knows, right? He's basically saying here, you might have a lot of transgressions, but this one really good or a couple of really good things that you did are so good that they outweigh the bad. And same thing, by the way, with the bad, right? The bad can outweigh the good, even though you have more single good actions. The magnitude of the bad action could be so large that it could overshadow the good. Now, I think the most important part of this is God only understands this. Human beings can't measure the magnitude or judge the magnitude or know the magnitude of either a good action or a bad action. We can of course guess, but only God really knows this. So even if you did go and count all of your transgressions, which is impossible to do, of course, but sounds like something that might be possible. It's certainly not possible to be able to weigh out the weight of one's transgression and one's merits. And we just need to trust God in this, right? This is where faith comes in, and we understand that God does this in a way that we don't understand, and we can never understand it. Otherwise, we'd be God. And that for that reason, we should therefore behave like every action is important, and make sure that we try to do everything. There should be nothing that we say, this doesn't matter, or this is an unimportant mitzvah or an unimportant transgression, but rather we should take everything seriously. Let's do one more. Anyone who changes his mind about the mitzvot he has performed and regrets the merits he has earned, saying in his heart, what value was there in doing them? I wish I hadn't performed them, loses them all, and no merit is preserved for him at all. As Ezekiel states, the righteousness of the upright will not save him on the day of his transgression. This only applies to one who regrets his previous deeds. Right? So if you do a good action, if you do something good or do a mitzvah here, it's interesting here. He says specifically a mitzvah, he changes the language here from zechuyot, from merits to mitzvot, right? But he says anyone who changes their mind about doing a mitzvah, and he has already performed, he's already done the good action, but he regrets doing it, right? And believes there is no value in doing mitzvot, and actually regrets doing the action itself, loses the merit of that action, right? And so I think there is really an important step here of God wants you to continue to want to do the good, to be thankful that you're doing the good, and not be regretful of an action you take. God doesn't just care about the actions we make, but the people and the human beings who we actually are. Very important here. And also, of course, cares that we know, that we believe, that we have faith, that there really is a lot of value in the good we do, right? Even if you choose to do good because, well, it's just something you do, but you don't believe there's any value in it, right? Or you don't believe that there will be any merit in doing what you're doing, right? It sort of doesn't count. We have to have faith that God rewards us for these things, and faith in the value of doing good in general. Very important. He continues, just as a person merits and sins are weighed at the time of his death, so too the sins of every inhabitant of the world, together with his merits, are weighed on the festival of Rosh Hashanah. If one is found righteous, his verdict is sealed for life. If one is found wicked, his verdict is sealed for death. A Beinuni, a middle person's verdict, remains tentative until Yom Kippur. If he repents, his verdict is sealed for life. If not, his verdict is sealed for death. Right? So obviously this happens at the time of death, and probably most importantly when we die, right? We're judged on the actions that we've taken in our life, but there also is a smaller judging that happens every year on Rosh Hashanah. And the idea usually is, I think that in the most simple way, if you do good, you get another year of life. If you don't do good, right, and you're judged for bad, you die, right? Of course, I don't think it's as simple as this. And exactly what that really means here is going to be something that needs to be discussed and needs to be thought about. For me, I think the way I read it very much based on the Rebbe of Slonim, very famous Rebbe named the Netivot Shalom after his Sefer, after his book, is that it's not that we die or live based on these verdicts, and all of a sudden we'll just die after Rosh Hashanah if we're judged wrong. But God sees if we're committed to life or we're committed to death, what kind of person we are, and bases what kind of human being we are. That doesn't necessarily mean that God is going to kill us immediately, but God wants to see what kind of human being we are and judges us in that way, which in some ways actually might be more important if you really think about it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for learning today. We'll continue learning tomorrow. Thank you.